In this video, we're going to talk about taking action on stories and how to capture, distill, and tell our stories. Now, remember where we are. This is a tool of influence that underpins the entire entrepreneurial selling process. So this is a tool of influence that will serve you whether you're at the beginning of the execution phase and generating and qualifying leads, or you're in the you're all the way forward to the analysis phase, managing a relationship and helping customers fall in love. A story will serve you at any point on the continuum. So the way I like to think about this is if we accept the research that suggests that stories are at least twice as powerful as facts, then we got to have them. So where do you get stories? I call this the capture. One of the things I like people to do, entrepreneurs and salespeople, is to be more aware of the stories that are around you. Where are they? Just look for them. People are telling stories constantly. You're reading stories, you're reading books, you're watching news. There are all kinds of stories that are coming at you. Now, let me be careful. That doesn't mean that every story is worth keeping. That's certainly not true. But an example I like to use of the process of capturing the stories, here's the metaphor. You've got a quiver of arrows on your back, and you're filling that quiver with more and more arrows. Those are the stories, right? Such that you can pull out the red arrow, that story when you need it, versus the green arrow over here. That's the operating metaphor. But the question then becomes, how do you fill that quiver of arrows on your back? One of the things that I do in one of my classes at Chicago Booth is I ask my executives to read an article called The Real Leadership Lessons of Steve Jobs on a Tuesday night. And it's an 8-page article. It was published in Harvard Business Review, and it's by the guy, a very famous historian called Walter Isaacson. Walter Isaacson wrote the biography of Steve Jobs. He wrote Albert Einstein's biography, among others. He's an amazing historian and writer, biographer. But he did a very distilled version of Steve Jobs' biography, and it's about an 8-page article called The Real Leadership Lessons of Steve Jobs. And then I play a little trick on my executives on Wednesday morning. So they read it on Tuesday night as homework. They come to class at Chicago Booth on Wednesday morning, and I say to them, okay, that article, Real Leadership Lessons of Steve Jobs, read it again. And they get mad at me and they say, Craig, we already read it last night. And I say, I know, read it again. This time count the stories. Because in an 8-page article about Steve Jobs, there are 25 stories. And what I'm trying to do, folks, is I'm trying to make them aware of the stories that are all around us. In one little article that takes you 10 minutes to read, there are 25 great stories about Steve Jobs. And so the idea here is, as you're out in the world becoming more aware of this incredibly powerful tool called story, make sure that you're grabbing them from places and capturing them and putting them in your quiver. This is absolutely critical. Listen to the people who are all around you. When you're reading, make sure you grab a story or two. And the idea here is not to get all 25 stories. Not all 25 stories are relevant to you or what you do. But you know what? Even in that 8-page article, there might be 1 or 2 stories that are absolutely powerful for what you do, or something that illustrates something about your business or your solution. You can use that story. You can tell that story to a customer. Grab it and make it your own. Write it down. Next step is to distill. So you've captured a bunch of stories. Now you got to get them tight. So you want your storytelling to be very tight. And the distillation process, the idea of distilling, is to get it down to its essence. Do I mention that he was wearing a blue jacket, or do I leave that part out? That's extraneous. It doesn't matter to the story whether Steve Jobs was wearing a blue jacket. It makes no difference. You want to take out all the stuff that is not critical to the moral of the story. So you distill it down to its essence. One of our famous American novelists, a guy named Raymond Chandler, long ago, said, he had a great quote, and he said, quote, "A great story cannot be devised, it has to be distilled." End quote. And I love that quote because you think about it, he's a novelist. You would think he's sitting down on his typewriter and devising stories. And he thought, no. A lot of Hollywood screenwriters think, no, you know what? No. The stories are all around us. We need to make them our own. We need to get them down to our essence, distill them down, and then tell them. And that's the third step here. Tell the story. This is very simple. I have very simple advice for all of us. If you're capturing stories and if you're working on getting them down to their essence, how do you get them down to their essence? How do you get good at storytelling? You just practice. That's my simple advice. And I always say to people, I'm a collector of stories, but that doesn't mean the first time I tell a story, I'm any good at it. When I tell a story for the first time, even as a collector of stories and a person who's written a book about stories, I'm all over the place. I don't know where to start. I don't know where to stop. I'm not sure what to put in the middle. But boy, the fourth or fifth time I've practiced that story, I've got it down to its essence. I've found the arc of the story, and I've made it my own, and that's the tell process. So it's these three things: capture, distill, and tell, and that's how we make these stories our own. Very powerful.